So far, we've learnt how to measure growth, how to acquire new customers, and how to convert or activate them. The most important aspect of early traction and long-term growth is retention. How to keep the customers you have and block holes in that leaky bucket. In this module, we'll learn how to define a retained customer in your business. This is different for every business. We'll look at how to measure retention and what a healthy retention cohort graph looks like. This is important to understand as you grow your business, and it's also the engagement graph every prospective investor will want to see. We'll learn different triggers to use to increase retention and how you can build retention even if your product is used infrequently.
Retention is measured with a retention curve, which essentially tracks on a cohort basis when say 100 users sign up in January, how many of them then return on February, and how many of them gain return on March, etc. This is not the same as stickiness, which is the frequency at which the user uses your product. So stickiness measures, say, how many times a user comes back within a particular month. If you define your frequency of your product is monthly, that is, you would like the user to use your product monthly, and if they sign up in January but they don't come back and use your product in February, you would define that as churn. And when they do come back in March, you would then define them as resurrected.
The first step in measuring the retention of your customers is to graph how many people used your product for the first time in a month. Then how many of this group, which we'll call a cohort, come back and used your product again the next month and the next month, and so on.
Common mistakes are things like defining the wrong frequency for your product. If your social media websites, such as Facebook, then it wouldn't make sense for you to define retention on a monthly basis, because you'd like users to use your product at least once a day. On the other hand, some products really should be used only once a month, but for some reason, founders define their retention as, say, weekly, in which case you're measuring the wrong thing. Look at the offline alternative for your product. For example, let's say you run a food delivery startup. Well, how many times do users order food delivery before before online food delivery? So yeah, that would give you a good indication around how often the user should be using your product. For example, in AirTasker, when a user comes in to do a plumbing job, you don't expect them to post a plumbing job every week or even every month for that matter. On the other hand, if they're posting a cleaning job, you do want them to come back and post a cleaning job weekly, maybe monthly, but definitely not less than once a month. In this example, we're showing the stack graph for the previous table. What this is showing essentially is a layer. Every layer maps to a single cohort of users. There are two things to notice here. Not a single layer completely disappears, meaning users retain with this product for an indefinite period of time. And that number two, each layer gets thicker over time, meaning the company is acquiring more users and maintaining their retention rate. This graph is pretty common with an established company in that retained users make up most of their active users, and acquisition, which is new users, become a smaller proportion of their total user base. So in any point of time, so if you're looking at, say, in January 2015, you can look at your total number of active users and when did they sign up to the service.
A retention graph measures cohorts of customers that join your business each month. Once you've worked out how active a customer needs to be to count as retained, then plot on a graph all the new customers who purchase in a month, say January. Using the same colour, graph how many of this cohort are still active in February, then March, and so on. The cohorts will get skinnier with time as people stop using your product, but you don't ever want the cohort to disappear completely. This would mean you're losing 100% of the customers who signed up in January. If all your customers churn, then you won't be able to grow your business. In February, plot new customers again in a different colour and track this group through to March, April, and so on. Over time, as you start to acquire more customers, the blocks should get fatter, and if you can also improve your ability to retain customers, then they won't thin out so much. The result? More active customers.
There are two broad categories of tactics to improve retention. The first category is external messaging or external triggers. This includes everything from emails, push notifications, SMSs, or retargeting ads, for example. And the other broad category, internal triggers, that is, even without your company prompting it, users might have a need for it. And you build your product in such a way that will enable retention for those users.
When you create external triggers to prompt people to use your product, it's important to keep in mind the different channels and measures you can use. People are much more likely to respond to a trigger that relates to their context. You might trigger them because it's their birthday, because you know they're in a new location, or at a time when they're likely to be commuting and bored.
So on the product side, there are 3 or 4 things that you can do. The first thing is to build a network to improve your retention. Networks naturally lend itself to better retention because it means your product doesn't necessarily have to engage a user, but to allow the user to engage each other through your product. The second thing that you can do is to build a community and content within the product, even so that you can continually engage the users even if they don't immediately require your services. The third thing is to make sure that you are where they are when they're searching for a solution. So for example, if you have a very infrequent use case, people would often go back to their original habit. This means they would Google for that solution. In the travel industry, for example, people Google Sydney to Melbourne flights rather than going directly to a travel company. And so SEO is very much a retention strategy for travel companies.